Okay, we are excited today to learn about artificial intelligence, which I know nothing about, and I'm hoping to learn a whole lot today. Philip Bourne is the founding dean of the School of Data Science, which is our newest school here at UVA. He's a renowned biomedical and data science researcher. He's published over 300 papers and 5 books, launched 4 companies, received numerous awards, and is elected as a fellow to multiple scientific societies. He was the first Associate Vice Chancellor for Innovation and Industrial Alliances at the University of California in San Diego, and the first Associate Director for Data Science at the National Institutes of Health. So we are very excited to hear him come have a discussion with us. He says he doesn't give talks, he does discussions. So get geared up for that, and I'll welcome Phil Bourne.
It's good to see you all. I sort of realize that I look older than a lot of the people in the audience. Well, yes, that's the only compliment you're going to get the whole time I'm here. Well, thank you. It's nice to be here and talk about this stuff. I'm really into it. I kind of sort of couch this as the good and the bad and the ugly, but we'll see how that goes as we go along. And also, there's so much that could be said about this that really I'm restricting it to some thoughts about how this impacts higher education, which, of course, you all were and still are, I'm sure, in your hearts, part of. So let's get on with it. So as was already said, I don't lecture anymore, I have conversations. So I would encourage you at any point to yell out if you yell out in agreement, that's nice too, but if you feel free to yell out in disagreement, that's even more fun. So, and I'll be asking you a few things along the way. Starting with this, this was generated by DALL-E, who's used DALL-E here? one person, right. Oh, you're going to be a fun group. All right, so this DALL-E is you basically type in a phrase and it generates an image. All right, this is an AI tool. Can anyone begin to guess what this image is? Any ideas? Just take take wild guesses. Tiki torches at UVA. Tiki torches at UVA. Well, we had that once. We don't want to go there again. No, this is Columbia? No. All right, so you can blame the AI for not doing a very good job. So this is basically Prometheus actually stealing fire from the gods and giving it to the common people. So the question that actually Thomas Friedman posed was, is this a Promethean moment? Is the emergence of AI in its generative form, and I'll say a little more about that in a minute, a Promethean moment? And I ask every audience I give this talk to, or talks like it, that question. So hands up, who thinks this is a Promethean moment, a real distinct change in society? The usual, and who thinks it's not? A few less. Who's too tired to raise their hands? All right, so I'd say it's sort of probably 50-50, maybe a little more think that it is. I, of course, well, not of course, but I think it is. And I'm going to give you some reasoning as to why I think it is as we go along. And you can make your own judgments. And at the end, if you want to say, well, I changed my mind, it's definitely not a Promethean moment based on everything you said, or it is. I'll be happy to have that conversation. I heard there's drinks afterwards, so yes, that's really why I'm here, I should say. Okay, I think a first question then is whether it's a fundamental change or not. There is some level of disruption. I think we can all agree about that. We read it in the paper all the time. Right? So, and of course, being a data scientist, all of this hinges on data. So I think it's really important to understand how we got to this point and what the implications of that are. So that's where I'm going to start. So this disruption starts with the data. And I'm going to illustrate this. And it's not, there's a fellow that's much smarter than I am, Peter Diamandis, who actually coined this whole notion in terms of the 6 Ds, which you'll see in a moment. So we have this exponential growth of digital data. Right now, the amount of digital data in the world is doubling every 2 years. So there's huge amounts of digital data being generated. And AI is a result, the ability to operate with AI as a result of all that data. So what does that look like in terms of this notion of the 6 Ds? And I'll give you an example to illustrate in a second. The first one is this digitization process itself, right? And then what happens as things start to grow on an exponential curve, you can see the slope of the curve is actually very slight. So this is the notion of deception. So at this point, you don't actually realize that things are changing very rapidly. Then you have this disruption when you hit this inflection point in an exponential curve, when things start to change very quickly. So, and then what other things can happen, and these are his other Ds, and you'll see an example of this in a second. Demonetization, dematerialization, and democratization. Now, wouldn't that be nice as that disappears? Okay, I've got to be careful what I say here. But let's take an example just to illustrate the point. And it doesn't matter if you can't read this that clearly, I'll talk you through it. So I always like this example, and it's an example of Kodak. So Kodak invented, you'll remember film, I'm sure. So probably some of you remember farther back than that. Anyway, let's not go there. All right, so they invented the digital camera, but they actually put it on the shelf because they felt it would actually disrupt their chemical business, which is where all the money was being made. So that digitization started to, and they didn't worry about it because we were in this deceptive phase. Meanwhile, other companies were developing better and cheaper cameras with more pixels, et cetera, et cetera. This predates, as you'll see, the phone. Then what happened, suddenly Kodak realized when we reached this inflection point that there was true disruption in the photography business. And at that point, they filed for Chapter 11 or 9 or whatever it is. But they basically went bankrupt. And the film market just collapsed. And then, of course, other things happened that no one really predicted. And that's another part of all of this. Things happen when no one actually predicts what is going to happen. No one really predicted that the cell phone would become the camera of the moment. And so that was the point when all of this, that business just became completely demonetized. The value of a photograph, which was quite high if you ever went to the pharmacy or wherever it went to get your photos developed, suddenly a digital photograph was worth absolutely nothing. And there were millions and millions and millions of them. And that then led to a dematerialization. There was effectively no tangible material associated with this. And then it led to demonetization because the business models that previously existed were completely gone. And then the craziest thing of all is suddenly Instagram and TikTok became more valuable than Kodak ever was, with a business model that was quite different than what had existed before. So what's this got to do with AI? You're nodding your head. I have no idea what it's got to do with. All right, it's got quite a lot to do with AI. So the question, I think, first of all, is in the context of higher education, will history repeat itself? And, you know, I actually gave this piece of the talk to the leaders of UVA several months ago. And I think, I don't know what kind of reaction it had, but this is the way I interpret it. So that, you know, we got digitization, so AI starts having an impact because of digitization, right? Because the way AI works is it's trained on models of digital data. And then once you have that model, you can feed it something it doesn't know, and it will give you some level of prediction. So who's used ChatGPT? A few of you. Okay, so when you use that, you type in something, you get a generative answer of language that's coming back, right? And that's just based on a model that's been taught based on language, and you're actually getting information back. So it's all based on this, based on the digitization of content, data, essentially the whole of the World Wide Web and so on. So with the deception going on, and then I think what's really important, everybody talks about, woo, AI this, but there's a lot more going on that really is also, I think, equally important in how change is going to take place and how things are going to get disrupted by virtue of a conglomeration of change that is fundamental. So augmented reality, I'll give you an example of what I mean by that in a minute. Sensor technologies, all of this makes huge difference. Quantum computing, which is a whole new computing model that if it really takes hold, would actually immediately make all encryption systems obsolete. So it means this would cause, if this happened overnight, it would cause a complete breakdown of the financial system, all sorts of things, right? That's disruption. So, and then you've got what happens when these models, if you haven't used them, you're not really perhaps quite keyed into this, but what we're seeing over time is the models get better and better. So already we passed the Turing test a long time ago. The Turing test is saying, here's a curtain, I'm on one side of it, and something is on the other side of it. I speak to that something, and I get a response. The Turing test is when I cannot tell the difference between a computer response and a human response. We passed that years ago. We're now at a point where you don't even know routinely you're speaking to a bot and you're getting responses. So there's a lot of argument about when these models will reach human capacity. And we can argue what that human capacity means in many different ways, and I'll say a little more about that, not too much. But so, what will happen, and this is a question I have for you towards the end, and you're going to give me the answer so you can start thinking about now. I'm giving you a heads up. What is going to happen when these models reach this capacity? What's it going to mean to you to be human when you're interacting with something which is actually made out of silicon, which appears human in every way? Knowledge workers must adapt to a new model of operation, including faculty, students, staff. I think it's going to change quite dramatically. And then just robotics is also, around the corner in many ways. And that's also going to have an impact. And so the job market is going to shift quite significantly. All the questions related to this, of course, when? And if you believe these kind of curves, you might say, well, this is years away, but you don't know where are we on this curve? Are we low down? Are we almost at the inflection point, in which case, hang on to your seats? Or, where else are we? So what would this look like for UVA, and in what time frame? That's the question. So here's where the good, the bad, and the ugly came in. Again, these are images generated by DALL-E. And, basically, you just type in something. I was saying, show me a picture of UVA under the best of possible futures. And you get the one on the left. You're not paying attention to this inflection point and this curve, you get the one on the right. Then, if you really want to see the ugly, then you get what my son produces. So my son, you'll see more examples of this in a second. My son worked until recently for a company called Industrial Light and Magic, which does all of the CGI stuff for the movies, right? He now works for a company called Metaphysic, which actually does AI for the movies. So we'll get to that in a second. But just out of curiosity, who's seen the movie Here? couple of people. All right, so here's a movie which essentially takes place here, which really means effectively one room in a house. And you'll see what the implications are of that in a minute. So this was my son's interpretation with a little AI help, but a lot of artistic rendering for what the ugly looks like. So, you know, take that for what it's worth. But these images are generated very quickly. So, yeah, literally in seconds. So let's just dig into a little about the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? Let's start with the good. We always got to start with the good. So learning. Learning's going to change within this kind of paradigm without question. So imagine that you're a history major and you're studying the time of Thomas Jefferson. And so what would you normally do? You go to the library, you go to the special collections, you do all these things, you go online, and effectively you would come up with some written work about Thomas Jefferson that you produced. But imagine you're wearing a virtual reality headset, and already all of that literature that you would have normally looked at, whether it be online or digitized and transcribed, is now available directly. And so you can already immediately ask, give me a timeline of Thomas Jefferson's life. And so I get this timeline of Thomas Jefferson's life. And I'm wearing this headset, and I suddenly move along this, and I say, okay, I move along the timeline. I'm moving. All right, let me stop. So let me stop at 1817. All right. Oh, what happened in 1817? What happened in 1817? Laying of the cornerstone. So, oh, there it is, the laying of the cornerstone. No one actually knows what laying the cornerstone looked like. This, again, is an artificial intelligence representation of the laying of the cornerstone. And then, okay, well, maybe I could have a conversation between the founding fathers. We'll come back to this in a second, because there's something we're actually working on. I'm really excited about this. And then, I can basically create a virtual environment in my headset to look at, which shows me what the academical village looked like as it was being built. So I got to ask myself, if I was a history major when I went to college, would I want to be learning the way I learn, or would I want to be learning like this? I mean, it's pretty clear to me that the opportunity and just that's not to say one shouldn't be reading and doing all these other things, but suddenly there are all these new tools and new capabilities to actually allow me to do this. So here's an example of what we're doing right now. I'm just trying to get this off the ground. Hint, I'm trying to raise funds for this right now. So I mentioned this movie here. So this is Tom Hanks and Robin Wright in the movie here on the top left. All right? So as I said, it was all taking place effectively in one room. What I didn't say is that it morphs them between the ages of about 20 and 70 throughout the movie. So you see different scenes of them at different ages. All right? There's nothing particularly new about the ability to do that. It's been going on now for 10 years at least. What is new is the company my son's working for can actually do this in real time. So I could be standing here, and there could be a monitor there, and I'm talking to you and carrying on and moving like a 71-year-old guy that I am, or I could be looking down at the monitor and seeing myself as I talked, as I looked, as I moved when I was 20, 25 years old. That can now be done in real time. So it changes, that capability gives you the ability to do lots of really interesting things. Because what would happen prior to that is Tom Hanks and Robin Wright wouldn't see what they look like on the set at 25 for like 2 or 3 days, because that would go off to a computing rendering farm and it would be analyzed and all the rest of it, and they would come back and look at the shots much later, at which point, of course, it was too late. Now they can actually see themselves going forward. All right, so what's the point of saying all that? apart from the fact I love what my son's doing. The real point is that it's a piece of a puzzle that allows you to do other things. And then you've got a large language model, which really means it's one of these AI networks that allows you to ask questions and get responses. So there are sites now where you can call up dead relatives and talk to dead relatives, right? Who would want to do this? This gets towards the ugly, all right? But this kind of capability is coming online. So that's the second piece. The third piece is to create, as we already saw, these kind of virtual environments that look like, for example, the academical village. So what is the Thomas Jefferson Project? So the project we're currently working on, which illustrates the sort of capabilities, not just of AI, but putting AI together with other technologies that are emerging, is I can put on that headset, I can walk into Jefferson's study in Monticello, and I can sit at his desk, and he's sitting opposite me, and we can have a conversation about whatever we would want to have, based on all the knowledge about Jefferson that we have, which, of course, at UVA is pretty much more than anyone else in the world has. So, you know, you could ask, when I told Jim Ryan about this, he said, oh, I don't know what questions you go to ask. But that's sort of the project we're working on. And the idea is not to create just Jefferson, but to create a platform that could recreate other figures, either historical or otherwise.
What is the cost of that? What is the cost of that?
The cost? Well, that's a good question. I don't know yet. I mean, we don't have a lot of the... We've been exploring the capabilities of doing this, all right? We visited Arizona State University, where they actually have a lab that's doing a lot of this stuff already. And, you know, there's expensive equipment, not so expensive equipment. We have equipment in the library here that would actually give us a good head start on this. The model probably is not that expensive to create, right? Probably a graduate student, postdoc, whatever, having access to this. Louis Nelson is, by the way, is very interested in this, as you can imagine. So, and then, you know, creating that virtual environment. The library already has a device. It's about the size of a small suitcase. I could stick it in this room, and in an hour, it would actually, at micron level, actually provide the complete three-dimensional depiction of this room. So just by firing a whole bunch of lasers, knowing how far it is, what the directionality is, and so forth, you can create, and they use it to recreate historic sites. Right? That's like a $100,000 piece of equipment to your point about that. Yeah?
Yeah. Would the model as it stands now ever have the response, I don't know?
I'm sorry?
Would the model as it stands now, being asked a question, would its response ever be, I don't know?
Yes, that happens quite frequently with generative models now, right? With ChatGPT. Or it's actually been tuned to actually not to give responses that in some way are considered, for example, politically incorrect. So, you know, there's a way of tuning these models to actually be, so that's actually an ethical question, right? Do you really want to get to actually what Jefferson is most likely to have said, or what you think, what the university thinks they want him to say? Those could be two quite different things. Oh, we're getting into some real good stuff here.
But also, what about affect and tone and the sentence structure, like how that conveys meaning?
Yeah, this is about sentence structure and conveys meaning. Well, first of all, Jefferson's pretty easy, because what do we really know about Jefferson? We know we've got statues, we've got portraits, but we don't really know how he talked. I mean, we know he talked in a certain type of, in a certain way, given the time. So you can recreate that right now easily. So you can have a conversation with Shakespeare that sounds like Shakespeare would have talked in 16th, 17th century English. So, you know, we don't, in that case, we don't know. This makes it easier, because I can actually dress someone up as Jefferson, do a motion capture, and capture the motion of someone. And giving the gestures, a whole range of gestures that can then be used in the model. So that, surprise, for example, when you get a question where you think that someone would be surprised, they act surprised. And so we don't have you look really worried about this, I have to say. All right, you are really worried about it. But that's sort of the capabilities.
So you mentioned Jefferson, and it reminded me that I just watched a documentary by Ken Burns, and a lot of the stuff that was on there, I'm not widely read, but I had not heard of about Jefferson. So in your AI program, how would I know that you have 95 to 98% of the information about Jefferson so that I could be really speaking to him?
It's a good question, and I don't necessarily know the answer, but what I would say is it's like everything else. Ken Burns' documentaries are fantastic, generally speaking, because they do an enormous amount of research, and they gather an enormous amount of information about the person, whatever the subject is that they're looking at in his style of documentary. And that clearly is what, 10 years from now, everybody could be making these. But the ones that are going to be the best are the ones that, as far as we know, match to as much as we know about Jefferson. So we don't know we would have 95% of what Jefferson, of whatever knowledge is out there about Jefferson. But already these models are absorbing huge amounts of stuff. And the advantage and the advantage we have, is that we have a lot of materials, much of which is still not digitized, that others don't have on Jefferson. So in a way, it gives us an opportunity to create a more complete and realistic picture. You're being very helpful here, everyone.
I'm not sure you're describing the good.
I'm not sure I am either.
Because suppose I was talking to Jefferson's avatar and asked him, how did you fall in love with Sally Hemings? Would Thomas Jefferson say the historians don't know? I don't know how I fell in love with her. In other words, I think that this process would inject a degree of certainty that may not exist in the answer.
That potentially, I wouldn't say that's necessarily the bad, but it's certainly the ugly. I mean, maybe it's the bad as well. But yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you for a second. On the other hand, you at any time, whatever the medium, I mean, you're thinking this is going to inject more of a firm output or a firm belief than would otherwise be the case by the nature of the technology and the imagery. Well, that clearly would be a mistake, because all you're doing is essentially, it's just a different means of getting at the information that would have come from if you'd actually been able to read all of the literature on Jefferson. But of course, you can't do that. And that's the power of the models, is that they are absorbing many, many millions of times more information than any human can absorb in a lifetime. I mean, in this case, it's a more constrained set of information, but it's still quite significant. We got lots of questions. I thought I should move on in a second, but because we'll never get to the bad and the ugly, but you're already there, so why should I worry? Go ahead.
I think follows on the question there. You have something that might be just 95. I don't know if we can get to 95% accurate. And I don't think that statement actually that Jefferson, you said to within 95% accuracy what Jefferson said, or I'm 95% sure this is what he said. I mean, you don't have any way of knowing a number like that. That quantitative evaluation is a complete deception.
Well, that's true of any historian studying any piece of work, right?
No, but no historian says I'm 95% sure, and people think it actually means something.
All right. So I misspoke. In that case, I completely agree. I misspoke.
Okay.
I got too enthusiastic.
But it's that idea that this is the most likely thing. This is the most probable. You said that several times. This is the most probable thing that Jefferson would have said. And
An interesting
doesn't
thing
really
about
mean-
these models, of course, is you can weight things. So if it's actually known to have been written by Jefferson, you could weight that more highly than something that is, produced by a historian who's read about Jefferson.
If the statement that gives back to you, generates for you, is Jefferson's statement, as opposed to a statement that combines several of Jefferson things, once you start to combine them, you don't have any idea what the probability of that is.
Lots of issues to talk about here. This is great. Oh, yeah, please.
Yes, I'm recognizing that we already in our culture have challenges understanding another human being's intention and meaning. And I don't understand how this is going to make us any better at understanding the human being, just because you know what I wrote a year ago or what I said yesterday. The human element is absent.
Is that true? Is that, you can argue that, I suppose. I accept that. I mean, in a way, you're actually imposing a human element by creating something that actually looks and acts like a human.
And being more frightening if it's not true.
Peggy, how are you?
This touches on that, but it gets maybe to more what frightens me most. And that is that we're all depending on AI. When I think of it, we're trying to use it for imaging, medical imaging, and to try to predict things. But you're depending on the quality of the data and how you feed in the data. And what if the data that's being fed in is knowingly or unknowingly biased or changed? What happens? And how do we protect?
Well, this is what many AI researchers are studying right now, because that's exactly what's happening, right? It's even more profound than what you initially think, right? It's what...
I'm as scared as I can be.
All right, you're scared. But let me make... Well, okay, if you're as scared as you can be, maybe I shouldn't make you any more scared. No, we'll come... Well, so, I mean, what's happening right now is not only... I mean, already these models have essentially scoured every piece of knowledge on the web, right? And now what they're doing is they're actually... Then as a result of those models, it generates, let's just call it synthetic information, which is then being fed back, potentially being fed back into the model. So we're in this kind of amazing learning curve right now, and all of the points you're making are really valid. And if all went really well and according to plan, we would learn from what we're doing here, and we would actually take those things into consideration. What you're going to see is you're not going to see one massive company like OpenAI creating ChatGPT. You're going to see lots of little models that are very specific for specific tasks, which are going to have quality that's variable, but and it's just like everything else. It's no different than a high quality journal, a low quality journal, and something that some crazies put on the web.
It depends on the gatekeepers.
It depends on the gatekeepers. And
Human beings.
so far. I don't know how many of you read the article I sent you, but if you want to be scared, you should read that article. And it's part of it's written by Henry Kissinger, so you don't have to take my word for it. All right. All right. I'm having a great time here. You're never going to invite me back, I can tell that. All right. So I think some of this, actually, I won't even go into this. We won't even touch on this, because I want to get to some of the good. I feel like we've been emphasizing a lot of the bad. But in models of learning like this, the notion of what constitutes a syllabi is, and in fact, the ability to actually have people learn at their own rate using these kinds of tools, actually opens up new doors. And the School of Education and Human Development is working on some of this. We're working on some of this. So I think the only point I want to make now, whether you like what I showed you or not, clearly it didn't go down that well, but I think there's a lot of potential value that can be got from these kinds of approaches to actually helping people who learn. We all learn at different rates. We all have different capabilities. Right now, that's not what happens. We all sit in the classroom together and we effectively learn at the same rate and the same. So there's lots, in my mind, there's a lot of potential here that we haven't yet been able to unravel. Okay, let's talk about a good story. Oh gosh, this is something from my own area of research, and I just want to give you a sense of this. How many of you were active researchers when you were at UVA? And just about everybody. So let's talk about research a little. So I work in the area of protein structure, at least I used to. Now AI has pretty much taken that away. And effectively, if you don't remember or you're a completely different field, a protein, you can think of a protein as the building blocks of life. We're all made out of proteins. And there are 20 amino acids in a protein, different types. And each one of those is a different chemical. And so you can imagine those as 20 different colored beads on a string. And a string, a typical protein, would be 300 residues, 300 amino acids. So that's 20 to 300 possible proteins that could exist in nature. That's more than all the atoms in the universe. Right? We're composed of a very small number of those proteins. And the way those proteins act is by their three-dimensional structure. So it's the shape of them that actually creates, really controls all the biological processes, and whether it's a disease state or a healthy state and so on. So understanding those structures is a really big deal. And I've been working on predicting those structures. So what happens, you take one of those string of beads, typical protein, you denature it, which you do every time you cook something. And what will happen with a protein typically is if you then cool it down, it will renature into its shape. So what that tells you, there's lots of caveats about this, but in general terms. So what this tells you is the information to make that three-dimensional shape is in that one-dimensional sequence of that particular type of colored beads. You all with me? All right. Lots of nods. Thank goodness for that. So what happened, and over the years, humans, myself included, have been trying to actually predict from these one-dimensional sequences, predict these three-dimensional structures. And we've made progress. We made progress over a period of about 30, 40 years. But then suddenly, not that long ago, in 2001, I think it was pretty much, is a small company in England, there was a spin-off from Google called DeepMind, basically came out with a thing called AlphaFold, and they cracked the problem. It was considered the holy grail of molecular biology. And they did it with an AI model. We won't go into any of the details of that. And that has huge implications, I think, both, and this is, I think, a good. There is bad in this. You know, as a result of this, you could actually potentially make a biological weapon. But there's bad in almost everything. But there's a huge amount of good as it relates to food production, energy production, design of new drugs, and so on. So what was key in my mind about this, which I talk about all the time, and I think about all the time in terms of how we operate, is that it was a group, it was done in a different way than we do research in the university. If you were doing research when you were here working, I'm sure you were scurrying around trying to write grants, and you were competing against your colleague up the corridor for the same grant. You were actually competing against each other by virtue of the way the system worked. The way these folks worked is they basically said, 30 of us or so are going to get together and we're going to solve this problem. We believe this problem can be solved because all the information is in that one-dimensional sequence. And so it was a different model of operation than would typically happen in a university environment. And I think it says something about the way we do research in a university. It was also very interdisciplinary. It involved AI experts, it involved domain experts, and so on. And it was a public-private partnership. I think these are all things that are critical to the future of research in universities and in this country, and elsewhere for that matter. So this is pretty much what I was just saying. There's also, for those of you who are engineers, there's also a very distinct engineering part of this, which often gets underrepresented and underappreciated in academia. So that was the good, all right? Hopefully you saw that at least. I'm sorry my Jefferson thing went down so badly. I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board. Okay, but one of the bad things here, in a way, is we now can predict these structures reliably, but we don't know how we got the answer, right? We know what the structure is, and we know it's accurate because we can then determine it experimentally, but we don't know how we got there. So we still do not know in a human body how a protein, or in any higher organism for that matter, how a protein actually folds. So we're dealing with these black boxes. So science is now becoming somewhat of a black box with respect to these kinds of things. So, you know, that could certainly be considered the black. There's a lot more to this, and I don't want to get into a lot of detail about it. But one of the things we've done, so the way this worked is that huge, literally hundreds of millions, billions of features associated with that string of beads was fed into these algorithms to actually get to this answer. That's way more than the human could actually possibly comprehend, which is one of the reasons it works. What we do as humans to compensate, and what you did as, those of you, well, any of you, would have done in research, is an act of reductionism. You actually reduce things to actually, for your mind to be able to comprehend them. So creating a taxonomy of things is something humans do because they can't embody all of these features. You've got to put it in a pigeonhole to understand it, right? So that's exactly what we did with protein structures as well. We had these pigeonholes where we grouped things so we could remember as humans, you know, how they were. The problem is you put something in one pigeonhole, and then when you look at it in more detail, you realize, well, wait a minute, it could actually be in this other pigeonhole or this other pigeonhole. And so the reductionism is very useful for humans, but it's also, at some level, it's also counterproductive because you're not seeing the features of everything as it is. And that's what these models have the capability of doing. So, you know, that's both the good and bad, right? It's good because they work, they give you proven right answers in this case, unlike what Jefferson might have said. I can actually say, okay, I predicted this structure of a protein, then I can go in the lab and I can spend weeks and I can actually prove it. And that's happened time and time again. I can't prove what Jefferson said, I agree. And I don't want to go back there. All right, you've touched on some of this, and I don't want to get into, you've touched on the issue of bias. That's prevalent in all of this. We have whole teams in our school and elsewhere at the university working on trying to understand and mitigate bias in these kinds of tools. So classic examples are people getting refused housing loans because the data associated was not demographically balanced. Lots of different stuff, right? You know, looking at, to Peggy's point about health records, you know, typically the health records don't necessarily represent, and you're doing things on imaging of, say, potential tumors. You know, if you're not looking at a demographically balanced population, you create all sorts of bias in the model. You're training the model inaccurately, and therefore you're going to get inaccurate results. So lots of things in all of this. We didn't even get to the ugly. All right. So here's sort of a bit of ugly, which is going to, you know, go back to frightening you again, I think. So Terry Sinowski is someone I used to work with when I was at UC San Diego many years ago. And he's an interesting character because he's both a neuroscientist and a computer scientist. And he's done some analyses where the current large language models and the capability of those models is about a grain-sized part of the cerebral cortex. So we haven't even, and those models are going to get more and more pronounced. In one sense, they're still a very, very small fraction of the human brain. but they're actually going to get bigger. And of course, we have lots of different morphologies in the brain. So to actually say we're close to anything that represents human thought is, you could argue, is a long way away. But, things are changing fast, so who knows? So now this is a question for you humans. I'm telling you, an AI algorithm would know who this is, what this is straight away. So here's the test. Can you outdo the algorithm? Does anybody recognize this picture? Does anybody recognize the characters in this picture? This is an embarrassing silence. Sorry? Monty Python, very good. This is John Cleese standing there presenting a couple who are having dinner together, who've been clearly married a long time because they're sitting there not saying anything to each other. And he comes along with conversation cards. So on a card it says, discussion about Greek philosophers. So this is where you come in. This is where I'm now giving you the conversation card. And here's your conversation cards. How would these, so you're a retired faculty. Imagine you were joining the UVA faculty now. How would these developments impact you? Do you see your research and your teaching and research changing? What would it mean to one of your students? Does grounds mean anything anymore? I mean, one of the implications of all of this, of course, is learning becomes much more, ever more online. And then the experience that one has and where you're having that experience changes. That's not to say students still won't want to come and hang out in the corner, but notwithstanding, there's other aspects to it. So those are your conversations. Who wants to start off? I don't know how much time we've got left, but I'm coming to... Oh, you got it. Okay.
So you touched on this very quickly, but if I were going home tonight and I had a toolbox, I would probably pick the first, since you mentioned the brain, I would probably pick an AI program that looks at the brain. My brain's not worth looking at, but supposing I found that something in my brain isn't working quite right, I would need a different tool that specifies the type of cell in my brain that isn't working as well. And I'd use that tool. And then later on, I might need yet a third program. So really, the programs that you're devising or using are really tools.
Yes.
So in response to the lady who asked the question about human beings and how the programs might replace them, we're never going to be replaced. These are just tools that we are going to use depending on what we need and how we want to resolve them.
Potentially wishful thinking. No, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, right? But I'll give you an example of something. Who knows the game Go? All right. So Go is a very ancient Asian game, which is very complicated. It's another thing where there are more moves in Go than there are atoms in the universe. And prior to doing this protein example, DeepMind actually developed AlphaGo, which was to play the world Go champion. And it played the world Go champion in 5 games and beat the world Go champion 4 games to 1. At which point the world Go champion said, "I'm giving up." All right. While he gave up, many other people started studying how the program was how the tool was working. So I think this is a different thing than you're asking, but that created a whole set of people haven't stopped playing chess because even though you can't beat a computer chess game, all right? But what was interesting about that particular experiment was I found there's a famous, I think it's move 37 in game 2. The program, the AI program, made a move that no one thought would have actually, any Go player would think was insane. And I won't say insane, we thought it was a silly move. As a result of that, it won that game. So you could argue, is that intelligence? No, not really. But it's actually seeing something that no one else has seen. Well, wait a minute, isn't that intelligence? So it can get to the point of being, I like to think about these things as tools, and I think they'll be tools for a long time. But there are people, if you read that article that was sent around, there are people, including very smart people, who think that there's definitely real dangers here. And certainly when, to the point where potentially AI algorithms can think they can act, that what a human is telling them to do is not the right thing to do.
So Phil, when I look at that, I think you're asking the wrong question, because this presumes that these...
You guys are a hard audience.
This presumes that the students that we're teaching, a lot of them expect to go on and get jobs, right? And particularly, I was in computer science, and that's what people expect to do. But the fact of the matter is a lot of jobs are going to be eliminated, so we don't need to teach anybody about that stuff. There's going to be a portion of things that will still need to be taught. But as you know, more and more software is being written by machines, and it's the high-level stuff and the breaking it down into pieces where the machines aren't very good yet. But in the last year and a half, we've had chain of thought, right, which is going to push us down that path. So I think the bigger existential question for universities will be, why do you exist? And even the bigger social problem is, do we want these machines to replace the intellectual work that we've traditionally done? I personally believe there will always be a piece of intellectual work that humans are best at, but I'm not certain about that. I mean, the DOE is doing automated science now. It's not particularly successful, but we're going to be there.
Well, I think that is potentially the difference between what went before and where we are today. So what went before, whether it be the Industrial Revolution, when the Luddites said it was the end and that all the jobs are going to go away, and clearly that didn't happen. And then the Computer Revolution, where they said, well, the World Wide Web and Internet and all that's going to, and it didn't happen. And one side of the argument here is, well, this is just another technology and we'll invent all new jobs. But I think there is more of an inherent danger here than we've seen in the past, because these really affect the human condition. I mean, I think about it, I worry about student wellness all the time. And I know there are people in the audience who worry a lot about that too. What does it mean suddenly to come in as a student when there's something sitting there that knows a lot? And what does it mean to me to be here in the first place, which is to your point about the role of universities? And I think that I would like to think that the role will be very different, but it will be an important role nevertheless, with the human in the loop of using these kinds of technologies, but always having something grounded in the human element.
So I'm a little different than a lot of you. I spent 50 years teaching theater. So what it means to be one of my students is that you need to learn how to be the human being you are in order to translate to an audience the humanity of the characters you are portraying. And this here with Tom Hanks could not happen if it were not for the humanity that Tom Hanks is, that was then captured in that film, I would presume.
I think that's true for where we stand today. None of this would exist. I mean, it's all human knowledge that's going into these models. But when these models are generating knowledge of their own, or outputs of their own, let's not necessarily call it knowledge, that potentially changes the dynamic some. And that's something really to worry about.
Change is always something to worry about.
So, when you train a model to play Go or chess, the rule in the board is 100% known. When you do AlphaFold, the sequence of DNA and the other things already published are probably accurate till 99% or more. But when we train a model on data that's not necessarily correct, how are we going to start correcting for the things that are the mistake? Because, you know, a lot of these are trained by things on the internet, and there's a lot of stuff on the internet that's just not correct. And so my big question is, it's the whole garbage in, garbage out problem.
Yeah, and I mean, it's huge. And, you know, I think the models we're seeing now, people talk about how they hallucinate. Well, they're hallucinating in part because of the incorrect information that they're being fed. So it's exactly right. So what I would hope is that the value proposition, and I hate to say this, but everything comes down to a value proposition, in the long term is going to be the models that are actually the most accurate and the best. And those models are going to be built upon the best information that's fed into them, which really talks about curation and all the other kinds of aspects of moderation that really goes into them. Interestingly enough, and this is a sort of potentially vicious cycle, is a lot of that moderation could be done by algorithms itself. So there's lots of concern, but also opportunity in all of this. I mean, I'm excited in one level because I think one of the knee-jerk, or the backlashes from all of this will be the desire to have higher quality data in everything we do. And, you know, and have, I mean, in a way, this is nothing that hasn't existed in different media forms for a long time. There are newspapers you trust more than others that you trust. There are things you listen to and watch on traditional media that you believe and trust in more. They've acquired a certain level of credibility. And I believe that models will do the same thing over time. I would hope.
And I'll say one thing even more. Imagine trying to do fiction, where the story is false, but the feelings behind the story are true, and more true than something that was really true. And how do you sort that out?
Next question.
Phil, normally,
one by one, yeah.
Phil, normally we would stop the lecture at this time and go into Q&A, but since you've already been doing that, if you're still up for it, we can continue till 5:15, and then promptly we can open the bar and continue with drinks.
I'm ready for that. I don't know what order we're in here.
Well, universities are supposed to teach the truth and also teach people to search for truth, but the output of these programs have no footnotes. You know, an historian, he can draw conclusions, but he gives the footnotes, and you can go look at the sources and make up your own mind, but this is just going to come out, and you have no idea what all went into it. So I don't know what you're going to teach students if all I do is read this stuff that computers produce. How is that teaching them to make judgments?
Well, I think there's a lot you're saying in there. Interestingly, you know, I think it's, correct me if that's, but one of the things you said out of this is that trust, the computer itself, you don't necessarily trust that. And maybe I'm reading too much into that. I mean, you know, I think it all comes back to the notion of quality in everything that whether it's in a model or whether it's in someone in the classroom teaching, whatever it is, or some combination of the two, which is what we're going to see more and more. Ultimately, it's the collective quality of that human and augmented capability. Okay.
Hi.
Oh.
Just a couple of things. You asked what we would lose. I think we would lose community. It's very isolating to think about the kind of learning that doesn't come with any kind of group organization. And maybe it also depends on what you're teaching. As a composer, teaching, for instance, a class in songwriting, there's all kinds of things that come out of what the group can imagine. That's very different from just one individual. Of course, on top of that, there's the issue that hasn't yet come up about copyrighted work of so many people that's being fed into this without their permission. So there are real issues about what gets accepted at data. But one of the things that concerns me is the isolation and lack of community and lack of kind of group creativity.
Yeah, I mean, I can interpret that in different ways, but certainly there's no question that in a way, I think teaching has gone much more in that direction over time with active learning, and where it is much more of a community activity, or at least and I think that's to map to what are the needs of the workforce right now. That's exactly what should have happened. So that's definitely a good thing.
What continues to trouble me is that fundamentally AI, and I don't like the term, but that's a different trouble, is based on language, right? At least,
well, I mean, not exclusive, but certainly what we've been a lot of what we talked about here is really about generative AI, which is about generating language from language.
Right, or from symbols, right?
Or from symbols,
as
yeah.
well. But language is inherently limiting, right? And everybody in this room has had to learn a second language in addition to the language they were born speaking, right? And one of the first things you learn when you learn a second language is that there are things that you can say in a different language that you can't say in English, or things that can't be said in a different language that can be said in English. And so I'm troubled by that, right? A computer can't have an experience. We've had people talk about empathy, emotion, right? Being able to imagine somebody else's experience or connect to other people. And so I'm deeply troubled that we're dealing with something largely through language and symbology that is inherently limiting. That's such a tiny part of what our brains do, what we do as humans.
I'm almost scared to try and answer this because I'm so unpopular already. But let me have a go at it. So first of all, my wife in all of this is this is about language itself. We'll get to the emotional part of what language represents in a second. But the language itself, my wife, complete Luddite. Over the holidays last summer, my son's, of course, totally into this as well, like me. We were having a conversation. My wife's first language is Ukrainian. So my son sits her down and says, look, I'm going to ask ChatGPT to tell you a fairy tale in Ukrainian. And it did that. And my wife said, I only understood about 70 or 80% of that. And my son said, oh, it didn't do a good job at the translation. She said, no, I think there was a lot of words that are being added to the language, and expressions have been added to the language. So my son then asked her to do exactly the same thing in Ukrainian that was spoken 40 or 50 years ago. My wife understood every word. So because my wife left, I won't say how old she is, but she left, at a very young age, and basically her knowledge of the language didn't evolve because it was just stuck in that period. But clearly it could be, the language itself could be recreated. And it's clear that's happening more and more and more in many different languages. Now the question of emotion or some other aspect of the language that comes out of your interpretation of that, then in one sense that's human. But you can also, this is where I'm going to be getting very unpopular, is I can actually imagine these models actually extracting their own version of the emotion from what it is that they've ingested, which is clearly something I don't think you like very much. But
my interpretation is going to be different than yours because we are two different human beings. So how is the language going to bring us to unity?
Well, in a way, the interpretation also depends on how the questions you ask, right? But if we ask exactly the same questions, we're not actually in the longer term going to get exactly the same answer. One of the scary things that I did recently is I went to ChatGPT and I said, what do you know about me? not what do you know about Phil Bourne, which you can get off with a bunch of rubbish off the internet, but what do you know about me? And that was based solely on what I queried over time. And it wasn't, I mean, if you don't think Google hasn't been doing this to you for years, then you're being, no, I don't want to say naive. Oh, I said naive, sorry. All right. So what you're going to get back is, if I ask questions, it's going to be tailored. Not if we ask the same question, I'm not going to get the same answer, because it's also encompassed elements of what I've asked before, which presumably at some level, I wouldn't want to say they're elements of my personality, but they're elements of something that relates to me at least.
Or as simple as your inflection when you said that word into the computer, that's smart, if it does all this stuff, because you are an individual human being, you are not a clone. Or you're nonverbal behavior, right?
I'm really loving this. This is so good. I mean, but inflections can be learnt. I mean, when I was at NIH, we were working on... Well, they're part of me, but they're also, there's a generic nature to it, right? So we were working on things where, on a call-in line, a suicide line, where you're trying to interpret, that's trained on a lot of situations, regrettably, those where the patient didn't, the person, I'm making a very simple story of this, essentially didn't commit suicide or didn't injure themselves, and where they did. You're training on those sets of data, and then you can pick up intonations to actually make interventions.
The intonation
Phil?
comes from the person's impulse as a human being, not as a machine that is copying something that they're trying to fool you with.
Right. But once they've done that enough, the origins are always the human being. But once they've done that enough times, then they can generate something that you certainly wouldn't be able to tell. We talked about a Turing test.
Right? It's like
It's all, yeah, it's probability at the end of the day. Yeah.
Phil, what you haven't talked about yet is infrastructure and resources. You've mentioned them twice, one about your ability to raise money for something that you want to do, and then the...
I can see that's going to be useful.
and then the third image of a destroyed institution. My fear is that we are going to progress so quickly, so fast, that we cannot handle either in terms of resources or in terms of structures to be able to deal with what is going to be available in terms of actual knowledge and ability.
Well, I thought you were actually going, when you were talking about resources, I thought you were going to go to the notion of the resources that you need to run these models, which...
That's really where I'm going.
Right. So with that respect, I mean, the fact that Meta is just trying to reactivate the 3 Mile Island, that tells you something. On the other hand, what we've also learned is that very recently there's been major breakthrough in the ability to model much less cost and much less energy. So, that's the nature of the kind of things that have been happening forever in research, technology, and development. But notwithstanding, there's no question that these things are taking a lot of resources. I wish my building had cost down. No. I think this is the kind of point I was trying to make at the end, is the formal thing before you all got stuck into me, was the notion that, to me, there is a fundamental question about where and how we're going to learn. I mean, it's got nothing to do with AI per se. I actually, and it's interesting how things come and go. So an example would be, I was part of delivering the very first course at UCSD when I was there that went to Coursera. It was a drug commercialization course. Right? I taught that course with other people to about 40 MBAs and biomedical PhD students for several years. The year we put it on Coursera, that 40 turned into 10,000. That 10,000, 3,000 graduated from that course the first year. That was the early days of MOOCs. A lot of MOOCs has gone out of favor now, and a lot. But you know, some interesting things happened in all of that. So there were user groups growing, appearing in different countries. People were actually getting together. It spoke to a completely different demographic, a completely different globalization that was different than the residential experience. And it raises all sorts of other issues and possibilities. I mean, we have quite an active online program, and what we've discovered is more and more the students online, even though their demographic is different because they're working, they've got families, they still want elements of that residential experience. They want the human.
Yeah. I have
Last one.
One statement and one question. I think humans are hardwired to interact with other humans. And if they just see a screen all day long, they're not going to get excited. If they're looking at an image on a mask, they're just not going to get excited and they're not going to pay attention. Is this coming through?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So that, and then the question is, I tested it once on jokes. I had a friend in the Galapagos, and I said, tell me a joke about an albatross, a tortoise, and an iguana that walk into a bar. And it told a nice story, but it had no idea what the punchline was. It never was able to do that.
All right, on that note, on the importance of human interaction, and I think
it's time to transition to the liquid enhanced portion of the program. So if we could thank you up here, Phil. This has been fascinating.
You've been a lovely audience.
It's absolutely the most interactive talk we have ever had that I've been a part of. So it's been fabulous. And I'd like to thank you. We have a small gift for you.
Oh, thank you.
It's handmade by Barbara Bondo. So I'm sure you do not have one like it. So
it's made by a human.
By a human, yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.